Welcome back to part 3. We've been playing around with a bit of the grid system here in action, just dove right into the action just to see it in context. And we've created this relatively complex structure over here where we have divisions and subdivisions. And basically what it boils down to is that everything revolves around this 12-column grid and how we assign the classes so that we can break it up accordingly. Now this is getting a little cumbersome due to the example I was making, so I'm not going to save the work here. I'm just going to basically close this file, not save anything, and if you've already saved it, don't worry about it. Just go back to your original download and reload the original file. Save changes styles. No, we don't want to save anything yet, and we'll just restart over here. So I'll open up home.html. We should go back to the original layout. And here in the file menu, we should have style starter and styles.css. So let's look at styles starter first, just so we can understand at a bare minimum what it is we need here and what we're doing. Double click and it loads the style starter page. Now there are some comments in here just to help you through the CSS for the first time you're looking at it. It'll give you an idea of what these sections are for. So what we want to do first is set some global values. Now this is the CSS that governs the grid system. You know, there's not that much to it, but it needs to be done in a certain way. So let's take a quick look here and see what's going on. We have this little package right over there. Now you'll notice the asterisk. Basically that's shorthand in CSS for everything. That little asterisk equals everything, meaning every word, every box, every list item, every whatever is subject to this particular property here, which is box sizing border box. And what that does is if you specify a container to be 100 pixels wide, and then you add padding, and then you add borders, normally those values for borders and padding would add to the total width of the box, and it would go beyond 100 pixels in addition to these new values. But by saying border box, it means basically keep it 100 pixels, and if there's padding and borders added to it, shrink the box down so that it still remains 100 pixels. Do what you got to do basically to keep it 100 pixels. And by assigning this as a global value to every element, it takes all the accidental line breaks and math out of the equation right there. Bang. You're just basically, if something's 100 pixels, it stays that way no matter what you do to it. Next, you have some other global values that you want to assign. Look at the body, the unordered list, list items, navigation, if there are articles, sidebars, sections, the footers. You want to reset everything. Now remember, lists and stuff, if they load up in the browser by default, they're indented, there's margins, they push inward. So you want to reset all that stuff right off the bat so that it doesn't influence the layout you're trying to make. This one we've seen in the past. It's basically same thing with the headings. You don't want the browser influencing the margins and spacing around these headings. Those you'll be applying your own. You're going to override those settings at some point. Next are links. These are the 4 types: link, visited, hover, active. What we want to do is just make sure that they have the proper text decoration assigned to them. So for example, if you hover, you will get a little underline on the link. These you can override at any point later on. And this is the end of the global settings. So we've reset certain things in the document. Now you can also add a few other things here if you prefer. For example, you can add in the body tag a specific typeface if you want to have global fonts, but we'll get to that later on. So the next section is basically designed to define our 12-column document grid. And I'm going to skip ahead first just so we can look at that column business that we were playing around with in the previous tutorial. So we have two sections here. One is column M1 and the other below has its equivalent column 1 here. Now the values are identical if you look at the widths here assigned to them, but they serve different purposes. And basically what we want to do is give ourselves the option to control things based on the environment. And knowing that we can assign more than one class to items gives us that possibility. Now what we're seeing here, which is somewhat new, is what's called a media query. And in our CSS now, what we can do is, let me see it, we can basically trigger certain events to happen. When we see at media, only on screen and with a minimum width of 160 pixels and a maximum width of 480, so the width of the window would be between 160 and 480 pixels, then you end up having this nice piece of CSS right here. And if we look at what this is up close, basically what we're telling is that if there's a class, and remember the star, which means everything, so look for a class, and in all the CSS, if there's something that starts with COL dash, then make that width 100%. What does that mean? It means that for mobile, any container that we've assigned a class that has this word in it, COL dash, whether it's COL-6 or 3 or 9 or 12 or whatever, override that and just make it 100% wide. Take up the full width of the browser window. What that means in practice is that for mobile devices, this complex structure that we have here, where we have column 5 and column 7, and column, here is probably 4 and 8, whatever. Just forget all that and make it 100%. What that means is that if you look up here, between 160 and 480, there's your media query right now. If I close my browser window up until, and it hits that trigger point, that media query, look what happens to my rows and columns. Boom, right there. So the minute I hit this media query with these values, all my previously assigned columns no longer work because we're assigning a new value to that, which is 100%. So we have our header area, we have the titles, we have our images, we have our text. If we look at it again, if we look here, how we have all these containers with different percentages, now they go to 100%. So back to our CSS, that's what this does right here. And it relates to what's going on here further down. We have more media queries. Okay, this one is specifically for tablets, and this one is for the desktop. And remember when we were assigning, for example, column 3 or column 6, 50%, right? These are all predefined values that we've assigned to these classes for mobile and for tablet. And that way, when we assign them to a certain class, we can trigger them based on this media query. For example, for tablet, 481 to 768 pixel width, yes, it uses the same values, but because we're using a different class, column M, medium-sized, we can now target for something different to happen here. For example, take a look at the tagline. Okay, in desktop mode, it looks great. The minute we go to tablet mode, it's looking good too. However, keep an eye out on the tagline. The minute I'm in mobile, where did the tagline go? We still have the logo, but now the tagline is gone. So what that allows me to do is, in some situations, trigger the visibility of a column or a section just based on the class. And if we look at the styles again, you'll notice somewhere here that that particular, oh, that's in the styles.css, never mind, we'll look at that later. But basically what it allows you to do is assign a different output for column M1 as opposed to column 1. And again, this is something that we'll be looking at hands-on. It'll make more sense with practice. These values here are basically mathematically derived from taking your page width, dividing it by 12, and turning it into a percentage with rounded off values. This could have been much more complex, but we just rounded it off for the sake of simplicity here. Here's another cool thing that in our grid system allows us to work really well. We have the row class. So every time I want to start a new area in my document, I would create a div with a class called row. And what that does is basically applies that clear fix for floats, because you saw with floating, sometimes our document just falls apart if we don't reset certain things. And in this CSS, we're seeing another pseudo class here. So we assign the row, and there's nothing special about that in itself other than after the row ends, once that closing div for this container is assigned, it adds a bit of extra special code here. Content is nothing. Clear equals both, and this is what resets the floats, and display block so that it basically shows up in the manner that you need it to. Now, what that does, if we look at this in practice, is, let me just open my page here. For example, this is a row for our navigation. There's a row for our header. More specifically, we have rows here in our content area. And every time we reset the row, it basically clears the floats and resets everything so that the next batch isn't all messed up. And that's about it. As we move further down, you can format your links, you can assign a page wrapper width, and this is the starter CSS file, so these values are blank. But the core functionality of the grid system is this stuff right here. You create your classes, 12 classes, each with value. So if you assign a row of column 12 to something, it will take up 100% of the width and work its way down between columns 1 and 12. The medium one is so that you can target the same containers but in a different context, tablets for example. And what we've done is, instead of replicating this and using it for mobile, all we did was just say, okay, just anything with a class called column, just resize it to 100%. It's the same as taking all of this. If I had taken all of this here, pasted it here, and changed every one of these values to 100%, it would achieve the same exact thing. So it's a lot faster to write this than it is to keep track of all this stuff over here. So just saying. Now, media queries we're going to be playing around with shortly. We're going to look at all the different ways of doing it and what it means to have them here across your interface so you can see exactly what's going on. Next up, we're going to look at the more robust styles.css sheet, which has a few extra things in there, and how that CSS is used to lay out this particular page. So check back in and we'll keep moving forward there.